My name is Denise Carter, and I was escorted out of my own bakery in handcuffs, past the display case I had filled with cinnamon rolls 3 hours earlier. 2 years before that morning, my grandmother left me her bakery in her will, the same bakery where I'd rolled dough on a step stool before I could see over the counter. I poured every dollar I had into reopening it. New ovens, a new sign, a grand reopening that brought half the neighborhood through the door. My cousin Vanessa stood beside me that day, smiling for photos, telling everyone how proud Grandma would be. 2 years later, she stood outside, while I was walked past my own storefront in handcuffs, accused of embezzling funds from an account she claimed she co-owned. She didn't co-own anything, but by the time I understood what she'd built against me, it was almost too late to prove it. By the time I understood the full shape of it, my name had already been printed in a police report, my accounts had already been frozen, and the people who should have defended me had already decided silence was safer. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what was taken from me, you have to understand what that bakery meant, not as a business, but as the only inheritance in my family that ever felt like it was given for the right reasons. My grandmother, Eleanor, opened Sweet Leaf Bakery in 1988, with money she saved working double shifts as a seamstress, hemming other people's wedding dresses by day and sketching bread recipes on the backs of receipts by night. She used to tell me the bakery wasn't really about bread. It was about having one place in the world that was entirely hers, that nobody could take a vote on, that nobody could talk her out of. I spent every summer of my childhood behind that counter, dusted in flour up to my elbows, learning her recipes one measurement at a time. She taught me that a good sourdough starter has a smell you learn before you learn the timing, sour but not sharp, like it's alive and a little impatient. She taught me to laminate dough with my whole forearm instead of just my wrists, so I wouldn't overwork it. She taught me, without ever saying it directly, that this place was going to be mine one day, long before it was written into any legal document. When she passed, she left the bakery to me, in her will. Not to my cousin Vanessa, not to anyone else in the family. To me, specifically, by name, in her own handwriting, in the margin of the typed document, like she wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity a lawyer could soften later. I was 34, recently laid off from a marketing job I'd hated anyway, and terrified in a way I hadn't been since my 20s. I spent my entire severance and every cent of savings renovating that space. New ovens because the old ones couldn't hold a consistent temperature anymore. A new sign because the old one had faded past readability. New health permits. A full menu relaunch built around Grandma's original recipes with 3 or 4 of my own added in. I remember standing in the gutted kitchen at 2 in the morning, 3 weeks before opening, wondering if I had just spent my entire financial safety net on a fantasy. My hands shook the morning I unlocked the doors for the grand reopening. I hadn't slept the night before. I'd triple-checked the case, relabeled every pastry twice, and stood at the door for a full minute before I could make myself turn the lock. Vanessa came to help that day. She'd always been close with Grandma too, closer, in some ways, since she lived only 15 minutes away, and I'd been across the state for most of my 20s. I wanted her there. I wanted my family there. She hugged me in front of the customers, told a reporter from the local paper how the family legacy lives on, and stayed until closing, helping me box up leftover pastries, laughing with me about how exhausted we both were. For a few months, everything felt like it was finally working. The bakery turned a small profit by month 4, which our accountant told me was almost unheard of for a first-year small business in this economy. I hired 2 part-time staff, Tyler, a culinary school dropout with more instinct than technique, and a weekend cashier named Marisol. I started sleeping through the night again for the first time in years, waking up not with dread, but with a mental list of what needed proofing. I still remember the first time I ran the register alone, a Saturday morning, about 6 weeks after we reopened. An older man came in, ordered a loaf of the same rye Grandma used to make, and stopped halfway through paying to tell me he'd been buying that same bread from this exact counter since 1994. He said the smell hit him the second he walked in, and he had to stop and just stand there for a second. I didn't tell him I'd cried in the walk-in the night before, out of pure exhaustion. I just told him thank you, and meant it more than he probably realized. Then Vanessa started asking to help with the books. At first, it seemed generous. Vanessa had worked in retail management for years. She'd run the back office of a regional home goods chain before it collapsed. And she offered to review my accounting software, just to make sure I wasn't leaving money on the table. I said yes without thinking twice. She was family. She'd cried at Grandma's funeral harder than almost anyone. It didn't occur to me to be careful with her. But her visits started following a pattern I only recognized in hindsight. She'd ask about my supplier contracts, which flour distributor I used, what my margins looked like on the wholesale orders, my login credentials for the business bank account, just in case something happens and you need someone who can step in, whether I'd added anyone else as an authorized signer on the account. At first, I answered normally. She seemed to know what she was talking about, and small business owners get this kind of unsolicited advice constantly. After a few weeks, though, the questions started feeling less like help and more like she was mapping something out, filling in blanks on a form I couldn't see. I mentioned it to my mother, Grandma's youngest daughter, expecting her to at least understand the discomfort. She told me I was being sensitive, that Vanessa had always been business-minded, and I should be grateful for the free advice instead of suspicious of it. My aunt, Vanessa's mother, said something similar when I brought it up at a family dinner a few weeks later, that I should let Vanessa feel useful, that she'd had a hard couple of years since her divorce and needed something to focus her energy on. Everyone had a reason for me to stay quiet. Nobody had a reason for me to stay alert. One evening, I stayed late at the bakery finishing inventory and noticed my laptop, the one with my accounting software logged in, wasn't exactly where I'd left it on the back office desk. Not gone, just angled differently, screen tilted a few degrees off from how I always positioned it, like someone had used it and tried to put it back the way they found it, but hadn't quite matched the angle. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the same thing a week later, when I noticed a folder of paper invoices in the filing cabinet had been restacked out of chronological order. Not missing, just reshuffled, the way papers look when someone flips through them quickly and doesn't bother putting them back in sequence. Then, a week after that, I walked past the bakery after hours to grab something I'd forgotten and saw Vanessa's car parked around the corner, not out front where she'd normally park when she visited during the day. Through the back window, I saw her at my desk, going through a drawer of paper invoices under the glow of her phone flashlight. When I opened the door, she jumped, startled in a way that told me everything before she even opened her mouth, and said she was just dropping off flyers for a farmers' market event. There were no flyers in her hands. There was no farmers' market event that week. That night, I started keeping a written log. Dates, conversations, anything that felt off, word for word, as best I could remember it. I made copies of my bank statements, my supplier contracts, and my original accounting exports, and locked them in a safe deposit box at a bank 2 towns over, somewhere Vanessa had no reason to know about. I didn't know exactly what I was protecting myself from yet. I just knew, somewhere underneath the discomfort I kept trying to talk myself out of, that I needed to. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, in the middle of the lunch rush, while I had flour on my hands and a line 4 customers deep. My business bank informed me that a fraud investigation had been opened on my account. Not because someone had stolen from me, they said, but because someone had reported me for suspicious activity. 31 transactions, they said, flagged as potentially fraudulent, all originating from my business account over the past 4 months, totaling just under $22,000. I stood behind my own counter, apron still on, trying to make sense of what I was hearing while customers waited for their coffee. I hadn't made those transactions, I'd never seen most of the account numbers they described. When I asked who had filed the report, the representative told me she couldn't disclose that under their internal policy. But a few days later, I got my answer a different way, and it landed harder than I expected. Vanessa called my mother, not me, to say she'd had no choice but to report what she'd found. That while reviewing my books, she'd discovered I'd been siphoning bakery funds into a personal account, and that she felt obligated to protect the family's investment in Sweetleaf. She used that exact phrase, my mother told me later, like she'd rehearsed it. The family's investment. There was no family investment. Grandma left me the bakery outright, free and clear, in a will that had already been through probate, without a single objection filed by anyone, including Vanessa. But by the time I heard this secondhand, from my own mother, instead of directly from the person accusing me, Vanessa had already given a formal statement to the bank's fraud division and hired an accountant of her own to formalize her claims into something that looked official. I called a lawyer that same day, hands shaking as I dialed. When I mentioned Vanessa's name and her sudden interest in helping with the books, there was a pause on the line, the kind that told me this lawyer, a man named Marcus Whitfield who specialized in small business disputes, had seen this pattern before more than once. He agreed to take the case, but he was blunt with me in a way I needed to hear. Banks take embezzlement reports from someone claiming financial oversight seriously, he said, especially when that person has already built a supporting paper trail. I needed to prepare for this to escalate before it got resolved, not after. He was right. It escalated 3 days later, and nothing about it happened the way I expected. I was pulling a tray of croissants out of the oven when 2 police officers walked through my front door, badges out, customers frozen mid-order around me, the bell above the entrance still swinging from when they pushed it open. They asked if I was Denise Carter, the owner of record for Sweetleaf Bakery. Before I could fully answer, they told me I was being detained on suspicion of embezzlement and financial fraud tied to business account activity. I remember saying, over and over, that there had to be some mistake, that this was my grandmother's bakery, that I hadn't taken anything from anyone, that I could show them every receipt I'd ever generated. It didn't matter. They asked me to step outside, and my voice kept climbing in pitch in a way I couldn't control. Walking past my own display case in handcuffs is something I don't think I'll ever fully describe to someone who hasn't lived it. Customers who came in for coffee stood frozen, some filming on their phones, the way people do now without even thinking about it. My part-time baker, Tyler, stood by the register with his mouth open, unsure whether to follow me outside or stay with the oven still running, a tray of croissants I'd never get to pull sitting half-burnt behind him. Outside, on the sidewalk, I saw Vanessa. She wasn't crying. She wasn't confronting me, wasn't yelling, wasn't doing any of the things I might have understood from someone who genuinely believed I'd wronged her. She stood a few feet back with her arms crossed, watching with an expression I can only describe as satisfied composure. Like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head more than once, and was relieved, finally, to see it play out correctly. My mother wasn't there. I'd learn later she'd known the report was coming, and hadn't warned me, hadn't called, hadn't done anything except wait for it to happen, the way Vanessa had apparently told her it would. As the officer guided me into the back of the patrol car, I looked back at the bakery one more time. Flour still on my apron, the ovens still on, my grandmother's name still painted on the front window in gold script, and understood, in a way I couldn't yet fully articulate, that this had never been a sudden misunderstanding. It had been arranged, piece by piece, long before that morning. The booking process took almost 2 hours. They took my fingerprints, my photo, my shoelaces, and my apron, which I hadn't even realized I was still wearing until an officer folded it into a plastic bag and labeled it with a case number instead of my name. I remember staring at that bag longer than I probably should have, thinking about how many mornings I'd tied that same apron on without thinking twice about it. A woman in the cell across from mine, waiting on an unrelated charge, asked me what I was in for. When I told her, embezzlement, from my own bakery, reported by my cousin. She just shook her head slowly and said, "Family's the one that gets you every time. Strangers you can see coming." I didn't sleep after that. I sat with my back against the concrete wall, doing the only thing that made me feel less powerless, replaying every transaction I could remember from the last 4 months, trying to find some thread that would explain any of it. Nothing did. The holding cell smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, and the fluorescent light never turned off. I sat there for the better part of a night trying to reconstruct, transaction by transaction, anything that could explain what was happening to me. Nothing did. Every dollar I'd ever moved through that account, I could account for in my head, down to the supplier invoices and the payroll deposits. Marcus arranged my release on bail the next morning. I remember walking out into daylight that felt too bright, too normal, like the world hadn't paused the way mine had. Tyler was waiting outside with Marisol, both of them having kept the bakery running on their own overnight. And Tyler hugged me without saying anything, which somehow said more than any speech could have. My mother called that afternoon, not to apologize, not even really to check on me. She spent most of the call asking me to handle this quietly and not drag the family through it, the same phrases she'd used when I first raised concerns about Vanessa months earlier. I hung up before I said something I'd regret, and sat in my car outside the bakery for 20 minutes before I could make myself go back inside. That first day back, customers who'd seen the arrest kept coming in anyway, some out of curiosity, most out of quiet loyalty, a few leaving notes on napkins that just said things like, "We believe you and Eleanor would be proud of how you're handling this." I didn't cry in front of anyone that day. I cried in the walk-in freezer for 4 minutes with the door shut, because it was the only room in the building nobody could hear through. My attorney, Patricia Sullivan, met me the next morning with a stack of printouts, the 31 flagged transactions Vanessa had submitted to the bank as evidence. As I went through them line by line at Patricia's conference table, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate at first. Several transactions were dated to days I remembered being closed for a family funeral out of state, days the bakery hadn't even been open. Others referenced a vendor account I'd never opened, never heard of, never authorized. The formatting on some of the supporting invoices looked slightly off. Too uniform, too clean, like they'd been generated to look convincing rather than pulled from real day-to-day records. I remembered something important. My point-of-sale system logged every login to the back-office software, down to the device and timestamp, a feature I'd paid extra for during setup, because Grandma had always told me to keep good records, in case anyone ever tries to tell a different story than the true one. I asked Patricia to request the full login history from the software company directly, not through Vanessa's version of events. She came back 2 days later with a strange look on her face. There were gaps, specific days, specific hours, missing entirely from the log, and every single gap lined up precisely with a flagged transaction date. "A technical glitch?" I asked, hopeful for half a second that this could still be some enormous misunderstanding. She shook her head. The system showed no errors, no outages, nothing consistent with a glitch. It looked like someone with access had gone in and deliberately cleared exactly what they didn't want found, then let the rest of the log run normally around the gaps so it wouldn't look tampered with at a glance. That's when Patricia told me we needed more than legal strategy. We needed someone who could trace the money itself. She brought in a forensic accountant named Rachel Doyle, who specialized in small business fraud disputes and had a reputation, Patricia said, for finding exactly the kind of inconsistency that convinces a prosecutor to drop a case instead of pursue one. "Rachel didn't waste time on sympathy when we first met." She asked precise, almost clinical questions. Who had physical access to the office computer? Who had my login credentials? Who had suggested helping with the books in the first place? And whether I'd ever, even once, given anyone else signing authority on the account. I answered everything as carefully as I could, watching her write in a small notebook instead of typing, like she didn't fully trust digital records either. Within a week, Rachel found the first real crack. The vendor account referenced in several of the flagged transactions didn't correspond to any real supplier I'd ever worked with. It had been created using an email address that, when traced through the domain registration records, led back to a domain registered years earlier under Vanessa's ex-husband's old side business. A company that had technically dissolved, but whose web assets nobody had ever bothered to fully shut down. When I asked Rachel what that meant, she said it plainly, without softening it. "This isn't an oversight, Denise. Someone built this account to look like your fraud, on purpose, using infrastructure they already had lying around from something else." I'd suspected it for weeks. In the part of my mind I kept trying to talk myself out of listening to, hearing it confirmed, from someone with no reason to take my side out of family loyalty, made the ground under me feel solid again, for the first time since the arrest. Around the same time, word had started spreading through the neighborhood about what had happened. A local news blog picked up a short piece about the arrest, and the comments underneath it split almost evenly. Some people assuming the worst, others defending me based on nothing but years of buying bread from that counter. Marisol showed me one comment from a woman who said she'd known Grandma personally back in the 90s and refused to believe Eleanor's granddaughter would ever steal from her own family's bakery. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, a stranger's comment on a blog post, but it was one of the first moments since the arrest where I felt like the story wasn't entirely out of my hands. Tyler started keeping a printed sign by the register without asking me first, that just read, "Sweetleaf is open, family-owned, and not going anywhere." I found out later he'd made it the same night I was arrested, sitting in the dark kitchen after closing, because he didn't know what else to do with how angry he was on my behalf. Rachel kept pulling threads, and she pulled them further back than I expected her to go. She talked to a former bookkeeper who'd briefly worked for Vanessa's ex-husband's dissolved business. She reviewed old public filings connected to a defunct home goods store Vanessa had personally run into the ground 4 years earlier, before the divorce, before any of this. Then she called me with something that reframed everything I thought I understood about my own family. Vanessa had personally guaranteed a business loan for that failed store, a substantial one, close to $60,000, a loan that had gone into default and was, as of 6 months before my arrest, in the early stages of a collections lawsuit against her personally, not against the business, since the business no longer legally existed to be sued. If that lawsuit progressed to judgment, Vanessa stood to lose her house, her credit, and any remaining claim to financial stability she had left. I sat with that information for a long time, before it made sense in the shape it needed to. My aunt's comment about Vanessa having a hard couple of years suddenly sounded less like sympathy and more like a warning I hadn't understood the first time I heard it. My mother's silence, her refusal to warn me the fraud report was coming, her insistence that I handle this quietly instead of asking a single hard question about where the accusation had actually come from, started to look less like confusion and more like protection. Not protection for me. Protection for a family secret about Vanessa's finances that nobody wanted dragged into the open, especially not in a way that might implicate my aunt, who I later learned had co-signed part of that original loan. If Vanessa could establish, even informally, some financial claim or oversight role in Sweetleaf Bakery, my grandmother's legacy, the one asset in the family that was actually generating steady income, it would give her a foothold. A narrative that made her look like a wronged business partner, instead of a woman drowning in old debt she'd never told anyone the full size of. And if I went down for embezzlement, the bakery's ownership would become legally disputed, tied up in litigation long enough for her to potentially make a claim on its assets before anyone looked too closely at where her own money had actually gone over the past several years. This wasn't a cousin trying to win an argument out of resentment or jealousy. It was someone trying to survive her own financial collapse by using my grandmother's bakery and my freedom as the raft she needed to stay afloat. I thought back, after Rachel told me all this, to a conversation from years earlier that I'd barely registered at the time. At a family barbecue, not long after Vanessa's divorce was finalized. She'd made an offhand comment about how some people get everything handed to them, while she'd had to fight for every scrap. I remember brushing it off as post-divorce bitterness, the kind of thing people say when they're hurting and looking for somewhere to point it. I didn't know then that she meant it literally, that somewhere in her mind, my grandmother choosing me for the bakery wasn't a reflection of a lifetime of summers spent learning the recipes, but an injustice that needed correcting, one way or another. Rachel wasn't finished, and she was right to keep looking, because people who fabricate financial records rarely cover every trace they leave behind. The break in this case came from somewhere I never would have thought to check myself: my own business voicemail archive. Months earlier, before any of this started, my point-of-sale vendor had left a routine voicemail confirming a software update appointment, the kind of message you listen to once and never think about again. I'd never deleted it. It just sat in the archive, forgotten, buried under newer messages. Rachel asked to pull the full voicemail history as part of the audit trail, standard procedure for a forensic review like this one. Buried 3 messages after that appointment reminder was a voicemail I never knew existed, an accidental pocket dial, recorded the same week the fake vendor account was created, the caller clearly unaware their phone had connected the call at all. It was Vanessa's voice, talking to someone I didn't recognize. A man's voice, low, businesslike, mid-conversation, clearly unaware the call had connected to my business line, instead of disconnecting the way she must have thought it had. She was explaining that once the account looks bad enough on paper, it wouldn't matter whether the numbers held up under a deep audit, because by the time anyone dug that far, she said, Denise will already be dealing with a police record, and nobody fights that while they're rebuilding their name. The man's voice said something back I couldn't fully make out, and Vanessa laughed. An actual laugh, short and satisfied, before the recording cut off. I listened to it 4 times, sitting in Patricia's office with my hands pressed flat against the table to keep them from shaking. This wasn't a misunderstanding between family members who'd simply drifted into conflict. It was a plan, built with intention, designed specifically around the assumption that an arrest alone would be enough to stop me from ever having the standing, the credibility, or the resources to prove otherwise. The fraud review hearing took place in a small conference room at the district attorney's office. Not a full courtroom with a jury, but it felt just as final, maybe more so because of how quiet and procedural everything was. I remember counting the ceiling tiles while we waited for the assistant district attorney to finish reviewing the file, because it was easier than thinking about what would happen if this didn't go the way Patricia expected it to. Patricia laid out Rachel's forensic report point by point: the fabricated vendor account, the trace domain registration linking back to Vanessa's ex-husband's old business, the login gaps that lined up exactly with the flagged transactions, and finally, the voicemail. When the recording played, the room went completely still. Vanessa's own voice, describing the plan in her own words, filled the silence in a way no argument from me ever could have. The assistant district attorney reviewing the case looked up from her notes twice during the playback, and I watched Vanessa's attorney, sitting a few chairs down for a related civil matter, go pale and start writing something urgently on his legal pad. Within the hour, the embezzlement case against me was formally dropped. The bank's fraud flag was reversed, and my accounts were fully released the same afternoon. And based on Rachel's report, a new investigation was opened, this time into Vanessa, for filing a false police report and attempting to defraud a financial institution, charges that carried real weight given the documented intent in her own voice. My mother wasn't in that room. She called me that night, her voice thin in a way I'd never heard from her before, saying she didn't know how far it had gone. I believed that part, mostly. I'm still not sure I believe the rest, that she didn't know anything at all, that she never once suspected what her silence was protecting. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that building. I felt tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with understanding exactly how close I'd come to losing everything to someone I used to trust without a second thought. Vanessa called me once, 2 weeks after the hearing, before her attorney presumably told her to stop. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she didn't apologize. Not really. She said she'd gotten desperate and that she never actually wanted me to go to jail, just wanted enough pressure on me that I'd agree to sign over a percentage of the business quietly, before it ever became a police matter. She said the plan had gotten away from her once she filed the initial report, and the bank moved faster than she expected. I asked her, straightforwardly, whether she understood that I could have lost the bakery entirely, Grandma's bakery, over a debt that had nothing to do with me. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I don't think I'll ever fully forget. "I figured you'd land on your feet. You always do." As if that made it acceptable. As if my resilience was the reason it was fine to have tried to destroy it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Not on that call. I just told her I hoped she got whatever help she needed, and that I wouldn't be speaking to her again, outside of what the courts required. Then I hung up, and for the first time since the arrest, the silence on the other end of the phone felt like something I had chosen, instead of something that had been done to me. Sweetleaf Bakery reopened 3 days later. Tyler had kept the ovens running the whole time I was gone, boxing up whatever he could and giving it away to a shelter down the street so nothing went to waste. Exactly the kind of decision Grandma would have made herself. I stood behind the counter that first morning back, hands shaking the same way they had on opening day 2 years earlier, but for a very different reason this time. My grandmother built that bakery from nothing, one shift at a time, with money she earned hemming other people's dresses, because nobody was going to hand her anything. I almost lost it to someone who was supposed to love it the way I did, who stood in front of a reporter and called it the family legacy, while already quietly building a case to take it from me. What I learned, in the hardest way possible, is that family doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it just means proximity, and proximity is not the same thing as loyalty. Vanessa's case is still moving through the courts as I record this. My mother and I speak, but carefully now, in a way that wasn't necessary before. The bakery is doing better than it ever has, not because of what happened, but because a lot of people in this community decided quietly, without me asking, that they weren't going to let it fail. If you've ever had someone close to you try to take something you built with your own 2 hands, tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not the only person this has happened to. And if this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, because we have more stories just like this one coming every week.